Chairman, actually, is it pronounced Learman?
Yes, sir.
Actually, heading in that same direction, and I know this is a bit of a lark, but there's other components that go into that food price. I mean, our farm policies in this country, subsidize certain commodity crops or make them more expensive around the world. So I once sat down with some agricultural economists who basically said U.S. agricultural policy kills people in sub-Saharan Africa. So, when you talk about sort of the food prices, particularly what we see around the world and some of the protests breaking out, what's a combination of just truly organic inflation and also government policy?
Government subsidies in the agricultural sector, I mean, as you suggest, Congressman, are themselves very controversial. In the end, to make it brief, it's a question of compared to what. The Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union causes, for example, corn prices and wheat prices, and they too are great producers and exporters, to be about twice or more the level of basic agricultural prices in the United States, because the United States farmer is the most efficient producer of all basic food goods and high protein goods such as meat products in the world. So that the elimination of subsidies in the United States, it is true, might make the production, the total output of farm goods, sometime in some areas of which we export 50% of our own output to the world at very cheap prices relative to the rest of the world. Those subsidies might reduce the prices, but it's also true, I think, that the profitability of the industry would change and the supply, therefore, would contract in the U.S. market in general, and thus make less of our output in the farm sector available for export to countries, A, which do not produce sufficient food to feed their populations, or B, have to buy much more expensive goods, subsidized at much higher rates of subsidy from the European Union.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lehman, and I know we're not doing agriculture, but isn't there also the flip side of that, that domestic agriculture in these foreign countries is often suppressed because we import a cheaper product than they can actually produce it domestically?
If I understand the question, are they able to import U.S.
No, no, yeah. Often our commodity hits the country often at a price that is sometimes below what they would domestically produce.
That's correct. And that
so
is
therefore,
because we produce it so cheaply in this country relative to the rest of the world.
And therefore, if we hit any price bumps or those things, they have no domestic agricultural safety net.
They do not. In some countries, most countries that are well advised have a food sufficiency strategy, the Chinese being a particular and a good example of this, whereby believing that they always have to be prepared for war, and this used to be the United States policy, that food sufficiency in time of war, total war, was absolutely indispensable, since only a blue water navy could fully protect the sea lanes in order to import food in the event it was blockaded by the enemy.
Mr. Chairman, may I unanimous request for another minute or two?
Granted, yes.
Now back to what I was actually really hoping to ask. Okay, if I was a market observer and I have a fixation on watching bonds and bond futures, but I think one of us over there said as his birthdays move along, he sometimes isn't sure what those numbers really mean. If you were me, and you're trying to watch the financial markets, where do I go to see a tell of both my future on interest rates and a tell of my future in inflation? Let's start from the far side and come back.
I think the tell on inflation is the long-term bond market, which will crystallize inflationary expectations in the longer-term bonds. And I think, contrary to what Chairman Bernanke and the Fed believed when they undertook QE2, long-term bond rates did not fall; they went up, and that because of the expectations that were stimulated of an inflation in the future.
With respect, I think that there is no long-term tell on anything, especially inflation, especially interest rates. Two examples from history. One, 1946, April, the long-dated U.S. Treasury trades at an astonishing low 2.2%. 2.2%. At that time, the CPI was running in double digits. When General Marshall delivered his famous Marshall address at Harvard the next year, the CPI was even higher, close to 20%, bond yields rather lower. The market was looking backwards. It was looking at the Depression and not forward to the prospects of a full generation of inflation and rising interest rates. Observation number one. Observation number two is the spring of 1984. Bond yields are quoted at 14%. 14%, and the CPI is at 4%. The market was looking backward to the experience of the tumultuous and wholly profitless period, 35 years of a bear market in bonds, rising interest rates, 1946 to 81. So the bond market to me is like a badly trained waiter, looking at his shoes, looking left, not meeting your eye. The bond market is an arbitrage market. That is, it is priced principally, I submit, off the cost of financing a portfolio of bonds and not with regard to a possible scenario for the future. The stock market is meant to look forward. The bond market, I think, is rather present-minded.
Observation three, agreed on all of the propositions that Mr. Grant just put forward. The one exception, I believe, on forecasting would be that when an economy is fully employed, all resources, labor, capital, savings fully mobilized, the banking system fully committed to full output. And were the authorities then, because prices were advancing, to establish wage and price controls, then I think as you, the observer, or the bond investor or speculator, you could bet on general inflation, and you could bet on a rising level of interest rates, and thus a falling bond market in the future. And the example I would cite would be the infamous example of President Nixon deploying the Federal Reserve to pump up the money supply in 1971 on the verge of the 72 elections, having on August 15th, 1971, declared the dollar no longer convertible to gold. And in 1972, with the effects of the vast inflation which were developing as a result of the Fed policy, imposing wage and price controls. We know what happens after that.
And Mr. Chairman, can I ask you no more cursing like that? Those are dirty words.
Which is the word?
Wage and price controls.
Oh.
Mr. Chairman, would you allow me, just because there's one other thing. In the whole sort of discussion of tells and inflation and my fear of a classic sort of cascading event, it's sort of the miniature version of a black swan, we float much of our U.S. debt very short term. Our WAM is, I think, actually somewhat dangerously short. If we start to hit some ticks on the short end of the curve, does that create a ratcheting effect both on interest rates and therefore inflation, or should I just stop worrying about it?
No, you should really worry.
Yes, you should worry substantially. The average maturity of the U.S. Treasury debt is approximately 4 years, which is very short for a country which is approaching a level of direct debt equal to total national output. Were the level of interest rates now subsidized by the Federal Reserve, despite their marginal rise, as Professor Salerno suggested, were the level of interest rates to rise close to market rates which are typical of full employment, the level of debt service payments would rise by an order of magnitude, consume that part of the federal budget, the total federal budget, which today is almost unthinkable and could only be as little as 4 or 5 years away. And all of the talk about cutting $100 billion of spending would be consumed by the fact that the level of interest rates had risen from several hundred billions to as much as 800 billions of dollars. So the political leaders of our country, the Congress, needs to worry very much about a rise in the level of interest rates from their present subsidized level to market interest rates associated with a more fully employed economy.
Think of how this might just look in retrospect. We're sitting here in 2011. We have a Federal Reserve that is suppressing money market interest rates. Its funds rate notoriously is zero. We are running $1.5 trillion a year public deficit. We are running deficits on current account of 3 to 4 or 5%, depending on the fiscal quarter of GDP. We are enjoying generation low market interest rates. And the measured rate of inflation, as they measure it, is comfortable. That is the moment. And one can imagine looking back on this moment saying, couldn't we see that this was nirvana, that nothing better was going to be coming down the pike? In fact, as Mr. Lamron just suggested, market interest rates were going to revert something like normal. So if the long-dated Treasury bond goes from 3.25% to 6%, and if money market interest rates go from 0 to 3 or 4, that presupposes an immense increase, as Lou just suggested, in the cost of financing these debts. These are the good old days with respect to interest cost.